The widow sang only at night, alone in total darkness. But when she vanished mid-verse, Miss Marple listened closer. "Welcome to Marple Spectre. I am your host, Mapleton. Tell me, where are you joining us from tonight? Reading your comments is my favorite part. Keep them coming. Now, let's begin." The village of Netherdean lay quiet beneath the golden haze of early autumn, its hedgerows clipped and its cottages nestled like old secrets in a patchwork quilt of green. The leaves had only just begun to turn, and the villagers, as ever, moved about their routines with the calm efficiency of a place untouched by haste or ambition. It was a Saturday afternoon when the peace was gently disturbed, not by alarm or scandal, but by the sweet, haunting strains of a song. It came from the open window of the Briar Cottage, where the widow Mrs. Rosalind Keene had recently taken up residence. "She sings every afternoon at precisely 3 o'clock, noted Mrs. Vincy, who ran the post office, to Reverend Barker's wife. "Same song, always in French. Lovely voice, mind you, gives me the chills." The widow had arrived from London only 2 months prior, draped in veils and mystery. She was a woman of 50 or so, slim and pale, with mournful eyes and a penchant for black gloves. Rumour said her husband, a Colonel Keene, had died under curious circumstances, though what those circumstances were depended on whom you asked. The autumn garden fete at the vicarage was in full swing that afternoon, with tables groaning under, jam tarts and Victoria sponge, and bunting fluttering over the lawn like faded butterflies. Children darted among the stalls while their mothers gossiped with deliberate discretion over lukewarm tea. "Ah, Miss Marple," called the vicar's wife, her plump hand beckoning, "you simply must try the elderflower cordial, made by Mrs. Trevor's and rather stronger than you'd expect." Miss Marple, in her pale lavender cardigan and straw hat, smiled warmly and accepted the glass with her usual grace. How delightful, a cordial with ambition. She sipped slowly, her eyes moving, with gentle curiosity across the scene. Her presence was unobtrusive, almost grandmotherly, but her mind, as always, was quietly at work, cataloguing gestures, overheard whispers, and those peculiar silences that sometimes said more than speech. At precisely 3 o'clock, as if summoned by the village church bell, the music began. The familiar voice drifted from Briar Cottage, carrying across the green. "Mon cœur s'ouvre à ta voix, comme s'ouvrent les fleurs au baiser de l'aurore." Conversation paused mid-sentence. Heads turned. The widow sang with startling clarity and sorrow, her voice wrapping around the words like silk around a blade. "Well," said Major Halliday, his brow furrowing, "it's a bit much, I dare say. This isn't Covent Garden." "I find it rather touching," murmured Miss Marple. "She sings like someone remembering something." The singing stopped suddenly, half a note before its natural end. For a long moment, the fete hung in an odd silence. Then a scream. It came from the edge of the lawn where Mrs. Vincy's niece, a bright-eyed girl named Lottie, had wandered toward the edge of the vicar's rose garden. "Come quickly," she cried. "There's a woman. She's lying by the hedge." People rushed forward in a disordered wave. The first to reach the scene was Dr. Sandwell, who knelt beside the still form of a woman in a navy-blue coat. Her face was hidden by her hair, but her hands, delicate, cold, and oddly positioned, told the story first. "Dead," he announced grimly. "Very recently." The crowd recoiled. Children were whisked away. A murmur passed like electricity. Through the villagers, someone had recognized her. "It's her," said a trembling voice. "It's the widow." Miss Marple looked toward Briar Cottage, where the song had just been sung, and said quietly to herself, "But if that is Mrs. Keene, then who was singing?" She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. Not in fear, in thought. Something had begun. Something ugly beneath the beauty of the hedgerows. And Miss Marple, calm and unassuming, had just stepped into another puzzle, one born not of rage or madness, but of the thousand small hidden motives that gather silently in English villages, like leaves before a storm. The shock of the discovery rippled through the fete like a dropped stone in a still pond. Conversation, once full of trivialities and tart reviews of lemon sponge, had curdled into murmurs, glances, and the crisp rustle of people adjusting their hats in quiet disbelief. Miss Marple stood a little apart from the growing crowd, her eyes drifting not to the body of Mrs. Keene, now respectfully covered with a wool blanket by the vicar's wife, but to the neat white face of Briar Cottage across the green, its window shut, its curtains drawn. No one saw her leave? Inspector Crale's voice cut across the hum of village chatter as he arrived, his bicycle propped haphazardly against the churchyard wall. He was a tall man with an untidy moustache and a perpetually irritated squint, as if the world refused to arrange itself quite logically enough for his liking. No one saw a thing, said Major Halliday, who had taken it upon himself to supervise the scene until the proper authorities arrived. We were all here. The fete, the music. She sang, as always, and the next thing we knew, well, there she was. Quite dead. Crale knelt beside the body, his notebook already out. Mrs. Keene, widow of Colonel Arthur Keene, retired, late of the Royal Engineers, recently moved to Netherdean, lives, or lived, at Briar Cottage. Any next of kin? None. Mentioned, came Miss Hartnell's voice from the back, half hidden behind a peony bush. Said her husband died abroad. No children. And she sang every day? Crale asked, standing again. At 3, confirmed Mrs. Vincey, who seemed to take pride in her consistency of detail. You could set your watch by her. Miss Marple, who had remained quiet, stepped forward just enough to be noticed, her expression as serene as always. I couldn't help but observe, she said gently, that the song this afternoon was different. Inspector Crale turned toward her. Different, Miss Marple. In what way? Well, you see, she said with a faint smile, the widow's voice always lingered just a little at the end, such a mournful, slow phrasing, but today it ended very suddenly, rather abruptly in fact. A performer in distress, perhaps, or not the performer at all, Crale finished, blinking. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Quite. That observation, once repeated, stirred a second wave of curiosity across the fete grounds. If Mrs. Keene had been lying dead by the hedge while her voice floated from the cottage, then who indeed had been singing, I think, said Crale, adjusting his coat as the breeze picked up. I should like to see the inside of Briar Cottage. 2 constables, summoned in short order from the nearby village of Meldon, made their way with him to the small ivy-covered house. The door was unlocked, swinging inward with a faint creak. The air inside was heavy with lavender and the peculiar scent of burnt candle wax. A half-empty teacup rested on a lace doily beside an open book of French poetry. There was no sign of struggle. Everything was in its place, but the gramophone was missing. She always sang live, muttered Crale, walking through the drawing room. The vicar said she trained at one of those old academies. This wasn't a recording. In the kitchen, a tray of sponge fingers lay untouched on the counter. The kettle was cool. It was, in every detail, the quiet home of a solitary woman. In the bedroom, Miss Marple's keen gaze was drawn to the wardrobe. She reached out and gently, "Touch the knob, may I?" she asked politely. Crale nodded. The doors opened to reveal a neat row of black dresses and gloves arranged with meticulous care, but at the back, half hidden behind a fur stole, hung a faded military uniform. "Colonel Keene's?" Crale asked. "No," said Miss Marple, squinting at the initials stitched inside. C.A. Keene. "Her brother?" Crale asked. "Or her husband's brother," Miss Marple mused. One sometimes forgets that grief does not always travel in straight lines. They returned to the fete grounds to find the villagers more animated than ever. Mrs. Trevors was explaining to anyone who would listen that she'd always found the widow peculiarly untethered, while Mr. Barnaby, the librarian, insisted he had seen a man leaving Briar Cottage late the previous evening. A tall fellow in a navy coat who hadn't returned his overdue books. "You know," Miss Hartnell declared, with a sort of theatrical melancholy. "She said the strangest thing to me just yesterday." Everyone turned toward her. She was standing outside the shop, staring at the war memorial. "And she said, 'Some voices won't stay quiet no matter how long it's been.' I thought it was poetry, but now—" Miss Marple did not speak, but her expression changed slightly. Her fingers, gloved in soft white cotton, tapped once against the handle of her handbag. "I believe," she said quietly to Crale, "that we may be looking for someone with a better ear than conscience." The inspector frowned. "What do you mean?" A person who knows how to imitate, perhaps, someone who could mimic a voice. I recall a young man in the village who used to do impressions at the Christmas pageant. An actor, wasn't he? Raymond. Edis? Crail asked. Lives with his aunt now. Used to be on the wireless. Miss Marple nodded again. I wonder if it might be worth paying him a call. You see, I've always found the art of mimicry quite fascinating. It requires not only skill but also a kind of intimacy. One must know the subject terribly well. As the constables prepared to escort the body away, the shadows grew longer, and the fete dispersed in quiet, uncertain clusters. Children were hushed. Banners were taken down. Teacups, left behind in haste, dotted the lawn like forgotten clues. Later that evening, the gramophone was found discarded in the stream behind Briar Cottage. Its horn bent, its shell scratched, its mystery deepened. And as the village settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat in her parlour with a small notebook and a single line drawn beneath the name Rosalind Keene. Below it, in her neat, slanted script, she added a second name, Raymond Edis, and beside it, a question: why sing for a voice already silenced? The village would sleep tonight with its curtains drawn, tighter than usual. But Miss Marple's mind would not sleep at all. The morning after the fete dawned with a mist that clung to the fields and blurred the outlines of Nether Dean's modest rooftops. The village, though never truly bustling, was quieter than usual, as if the hedgerows themselves were holding their breath. The murder of Rosalind Keene had settled like fog across the parish, filtering into every conversation, every cup of tea, every glance exchanged in the greengrocer's or at the pump. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and made a solitary walk to the churchyard, ostensibly to tend the memorial bed she'd planted in honour of her cousin Letitia. She clipped back the asters with a small pair of shears, her eyes wandering now and then to the stone bench near the yew tree. That was where Mrs. Keene had been seen often, sometimes humming to herself, sometimes simply staring across the mossed tombstones as though expecting a reply. By 9:30, Miss Marple was seated in the vicarage drawing-room, a place of solemn comfort, where the scent of pipe tobacco still lingered despite the vicar's efforts to please his wife by smoking outdoors. Reverend Barker sat across from her, looking uncomfortable in his collar. "It is a terrible thing," he said, stirring his tea, though he had not added sugar, "and so very sudden. She was peculiar, yes, but not unpleasant. There was something undeniably refined about her, poised, always in black but not morbid, you know what I mean." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "She gave the impression of someone always at a funeral, though not necessarily her own." Reverend Barker blinked, then chuckled awkwardly. "Yes, precisely. You have the knack of putting things just so." "She had secrets," Miss Marple continued, her tone mild. "Everyone does, of course, but hers were heavy, not the common sort, unpaid bills or broken hearts. She carried her secrets like someone aware they might one day be used against her." The vicar looked suddenly thoughtful. "Now that you mention it, she came to confession once. I shouldn't say too much, of course, but it wasn't like most confessions. It was more of a rehearsal, as if she were practicing how to say something without actually saying it." Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "Confession is as much performance as truth when fear gets involved." He nodded slowly. "Do you think the inspector is on the right trail? He seemed interested in that young man, Edis. Strange boy, always quoting things. Mimicked my entire Christmas sermon once. Flawless. Gave me the oddest sensation, like hearing myself at my own funeral." "I do believe he warrants a visit," said Miss Marple, "but not a formal one, which is why, just before noon, she found herself walking toward the ivy-draped cottage of Mrs. Moffat, who had taken in her nephew Raymond, after his stage career had rather spectacularly failed to thrive. The garden path was slightly overgrown, and a cracked gnome stood watch over a row of battered begonias. Mrs. Moffat was a bird-like woman, with wiry white hair and the habit of nodding twice before she spoke. "Oh, Miss Marple, yes, come in. Raymond's here, not quite himself, I'm afraid. Very disturbed by the events of yesterday. Such a sensitive boy." Miss Marple entered the modest parlour, her eyes immediately noting the scattering of theatre programs on the sideboard, a volume of Oscar Wilde on the floor, and an empty brandy glass, its presence delicately out of place before noon. Raymond Edis sat by the fireplace, his legs crossed at an angle that spoke more of habit than comfort. He was pale, with dark circles under his eyes and fingers that twitched slightly as he toyed with a cigarette case. "Miss Marple," he said, with the faintest dramatic flair. "Come to ask if I'm the village killer. I assure you, I'd have left a note." "I never suspect anyone who is eager to appear clever," she replied with a smile. "Only those who are clever enough to seem ordinary." He chuckled. "Well said. But I'm afraid I'm neither. I'm just a failed actor hiding in my aunt's knitting parlor and hoping the scandal finds someone more interesting." Miss Marple sat, folded her hands. "It is curious, you know, Mrs. Keene's voice was heard quite clearly at the fete, and yet she lay dead at the edge of the garden. Are you suggesting I threw my voice across the green?" "Not quite." "But I wonder, you could imitate her, could you not?" He gave her a long, measuring look, then shrugged. "If I had wanted to. Yes, the timbre wasn't difficult. Breath control, melancholy lilt. She had a pattern, always slowed the last line. She once told me that ending a song was like stepping into a memory, painfully theatrical. She liked me because I listened. She trusted you, more than most. She'd been through something terrible, said so herself, always afraid. Though she'd never say of what. I thought it was her past." "Did she ever ask you to sing for her?" Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. He hesitated. "Once, as a joke," she said, "just to hear herself as others might. I mimicked. Her voice reading aloud from a letter she'd written. She found it funny, or said she did." Miss Marple nodded, as though this had confirmed something she already suspected. "And did you ever meet anyone from her past? A visitor, perhaps? A gentleman caller?" "No one I saw," Raymond said, frowning. "But I heard her one evening, talking to someone. I'd stepped out back for a smoke. The window was open. She was pleading with him, saying she hadn't meant to hurt anyone, that it was an accident. Did you see him?" "No," Raymond said quietly. "But I remember the voice. Deep, cultured, military, perhaps." Miss Marple's eyes glinted faintly. "Thank you, Mr. Edis. I think that's all for now." As she rose to leave, Raymond asked, "Do you think I should be afraid?" She paused at the door. "If you are innocent, Mr. Edis, then you are not in danger. But I would be very careful about opening your door at night." The sun had come out fully by the time Miss Marple stepped back onto the lane, and the mist had burned away, leaving the village in sharp, unforgiving light. She walked slowly, her mind piecing together a tapestry of details, voice by voice, secret by secret. Rosalind Keene had not been afraid of death, Miss Marple thought. She had been afraid of something far older, something that could not be buried with a body or sung away with a sad aria. And somewhere, someone else was afraid now too, because Miss Marple was listening, and silence, she knew, was only ever a temporary refuge. Inspector Crail was not a man to dawdle when he believed himself close to a solution. The visit to Briar Cottage, the discarded gramophone, and now this peculiar business with Raymond Edis, a known mimic with an ear for detail and a tragic tendency toward theatrical self-absorption, all of it seemed, to him, enough to narrow the circle decisively. By that same afternoon he had summoned Mr. Edis to the constabulary office in Meldon for a formal questioning. Though there was no arrest, the implication hung heavy in the air like damp wool. The villagers, quick to scent scandal, responded with their usual veiled cheerfulness and whispered theories. At the bakery, Mrs. Vincey declared with absolute certainty that Edis had been infatuated with the widow and couldn't bear to be spurned. At the butcher's, Mr. Tegg suggested it was the other way around, that Rosalind Keene had used the boy to cover up a darker scheme, and he'd taken her out when she became a liability. Meanwhile, old Miss Cramley insisted the whole affair was something foreign, continental perhaps, poison rings and false names and whatnot. Miss Marple, seated near the window of her drawing-room, listened to none of this. Her focus lay on the quiet undercurrents, the things people did not say, the questions no one thought to ask. Raymond Edis might very well be entangled in the matter, but not in the way Inspector Crail believed. Mimicry was a tool, yes, but Also a trap for the easily impressed. No, Miss Marple felt that Edis was being used. That afternoon, as the air grew warm and the scent of rosemary rose from the garden beds, she received an unexpected visitor. It was Dr. Sandwell, the village physician. He was a man of 70 with thinning grey hair and a thoughtful manner that bordered on evasive. He carried a leather satchel and wore the perpetual expression of someone translating his thoughts from Latin before speaking. "Miss Marple," he said, removing his hat as he stepped into her sitting room. "I wonder if I might have a word. It concerns Mrs. Keene." "Of course," she said, motioning to the chair near the hearth. "I was hoping you might come." He sat slowly, adjusting his cuffs. "I was her doctor, in a sense. She didn't consult me often, but she had me over a few weeks ago. Said she was experiencing palpitations, shortness of breath. Was she truly unwell? Not in any way that medicine could cure. The symptoms were inconsistent. Classic signs of anxiety, I'd say. But she was frightened. Terribly so. I asked if there had been a recent trauma, but she only smiled and said she was merely haunted by the living." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Haunted, you say? How poetic." She was a poetic sort, but what struck me was her pulse. It would race when she spoke of the war, and of a man. She didn't say who, only that he had a voice like polished stone and a face she couldn't forget. I thought at the time it was a lover, but now she had no children, Miss Marple said quietly. No known relatives, only that uniform in her wardrobe with the initials C.A. Keene. "Yes," Sandwell nodded. "I noticed the same when I paid my respects at the house with Crail. C.A., not A.C. Her husband was Arthur Charles, not Charles Arthur." Miss Marple rose and walked to the mantel. She reached for a small frame holding a faded photograph of a younger Colonel Keene, standing stiffly in uniform, moustache precise, eyes unreadable. "The Colonel died in 1947, did he not?" She asked. "So it said," Sandwell replied, watching her. "But," Miss Marple murmured, "only said." The doctor hesitated. "You think he's alive?" "I think," she said slowly, "that someone is pretending not to be. And I think Rosalind Keene knew too much to survive that lie." Later that evening, Miss Marple made a point of visiting the church. Reverend Barker had offered to show her the records, and she'd accepted with quiet urgency. In the musty vestry, beneath yellowing ledgers and moth-nibbled sermon scrolls, they found the burial registry. "Arthur Charles Keene," the vicar read, tracing a bony finger across the line. "Buried June 14, 1947. Death recorded in Cairo, military ceremony, but no local grave, no coffin received." Miss Marple studied the page. "That's not uncommon for wartime deaths," she murmured. "But how strange that no one seems to know what happened to his brother if he had one." "C.A. Keene. You think he returned?" asked the vicar. "No," she said. "I think he never left. And that Rosalind's voice, her real voice, was not the only one imitated. While she returned home, the wind had risen. It whistled through the hedgerows and made the garden gate creak like a warning. Miss Marple lit the sitting-room fire and sat with her knitting untouched in her lap. Inspector Crail would undoubtedly return in the morning to press Raymond Edis further. But it was not Raymond who had constructed the illusion. It was someone older, someone with authority, someone who could recite military history and recall a time before the world had changed its order. And then she remembered a detail. The widow's remark to Miss Hartnell. "Some voices won't stay quiet, no matter how long it's been." It was not the dead who were speaking, but the past refusing to remain silent. At midnight, a knock came at her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Trevors, the baker's wife, clutching a shawl around her shoulders and looking pale. "Miss Marple," she whispered, "you must come. There's been another incident at the inn. The stranger, he's collapsed. And he was asking for Rosalind, over and over again." Miss Marple's heart did not quicken, but her eyes grew sharp. "Then," she said, taking up her handbag, "we may be closer than I thought." The Netherdean Inn stood silent in the hush of night, its shutters drawn against the restless wind. A single light glowed behind the lace curtain of the parlour, casting a weak amber halo over the cobbled yard. Miss Marple arrived, shawl neatly pinned and face composed, though her thoughts moved swiftly beneath the surface. Mrs. Trevors led her through the side entrance, away from the curious eyes of the late drinkers still lingering in the lounge. "He came in not 2 hours ago," Mrs. Trevors whispered as they moved down the corridor. "Didn't give his name, just said he needed a room and a stiff drink. But the moment he sat down by the fire, he started muttering, 'Rosalind,' over and over, and something about Cairo. Then he just collapsed." They entered the small guest parlor, where the stranger lay stretched out on the sofa, coat unbuttoned and face pale. A fire flickered low in the grate, and the scent of whiskey clung faintly to the air. Beside him the village doctor knelt, checking his pulse with a frown. "He's not dying," said Dr. Sandwell, glancing up as Miss Marple entered. "Just shock, I think. Perhaps strain. Whatever brought him here, it's cost him more than he expected." Miss Marple approached slowly, taking in the man's features. He was no longer young, perhaps in his late 50s, with a weathered face and a rigid posture that remained even in unconsciousness. His hands were calloused, the knuckles faintly bruised, and on his left wrist, faint but unmistakable, was the white ghost of a wristwatch tan line, recently absent. She looked to the chair beside the hearth, where a glass sat empty. On the floor beside it, half kicked beneath the rug, lay a crumpled piece of paper. "May I?" she asked gently. Sandwell nodded. Miss Marple reached down and retrieved the note. It was torn at the edges, written in a thin, slanted hand, clearly Rosalind's. Though smudged, the ink was still legible. "Don't come here. It is done. They will suspect. Let what's buried remain. You promised me that much. Please, no." Signature, no date. But the paper had a faint watermark, a crowned lion standing beneath the initials A.C.K., Arthur Charles Keene. Miss Marple folded the paper carefully. "This was not left by chance," she said softly. "It's a thread." The man stirred then, eyelids fluttering. His gaze moved rapidly before settling on Miss Marple. He blinked once, twice. "You're not her," he rasped. "No," she said kindly. "I'm a friend. You've had a shock, but you're safe now." He sat up slowly, the tension in his shoulders returning with every inch. "I didn't mean to come back," he muttered. "I'd made peace with it. But when I heard about the fate, the singing..." His voice broke. Miss Marple waited, letting silence invite honesty. "She sang that song," he said finally. "It was always her way of calling. I thought perhaps it meant she forgave me. But I was too late." "Forgive you for what?" she asked, though her tone remained gentle, almost maternal. He did not answer. Instead, he pulled something from his inner pocket, a dog tag, old and worn smooth by time. He placed it in her hand. It read, "Keene Charles A. Number 47825. R.E. Sandwell inhaled sharply. "Then you're..." "I am," he said, "though I wasn't meant to be." Miss Marple turned the tag over. On the reverse was a faint etching, probably scratched. "There with a pocket-knife during a long vigil. A single word, Mercy. I suppose," she said quietly. "This is the part where you tell us why your brother was declared dead in your place." He looked at her then, not with surprise, but a weary sort of relief, as if someone else had finally reached the same weary conclusion he'd lived with for decades. "We were both stationed near Cairo," he said, voice growing steadier. "There was a fire at the base. My brother Arthur was caught in it. I pulled him free, but not before he took the worst of it. His papers were on me, my identity, my watch. When they found us, they assumed he was me." "And you let them," Miss Marple said. "I was tired," he said. "Tired of being the spare Keene. Arthur had the career, the medals, the wife. I'd lost everything by then. My rank, my money. She loved him, not me. And after the war, I saw no reason to correct the mistake." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "She? Rosalind," he whispered. "We'd known each other before she met Arthur. I introduced them." He closed his eyes. "He didn't treat her kindly, you know. You can be cruel without ever raising your voice. I saw her once more after the war. She thought I was a ghost. I let her think so. But then she came here," said Miss Marple, "and so did you. I heard something in London. A man I knew, retired signals officer, mentioned a singer in Nether Dean who reminded him of Cairo. I thought, perhaps she was trying to send me a message I had to see for myself. He sagged then, as if the last of his strength had gone with the confession. Miss Marple, who had remained quiet for some moments, now stood. Rosalind, she said gently, was being blackmailed. Subtly, yes, but unmistakably. The singing, her routine, her isolation, those were her signals. But I fear the message wasn't meant for you. The man's brow furrowed. What do you mean? She was warning someone, Miss Marple said, or trying to, and when she realized that person had returned, or perhaps never left at all, she became desperate. But someone else knew her habits better than she realized, knew the timing of her song, knew it well enough to imitate it. She looked down at the note again. You promised me that much. She knew you wouldn't come, not unless things were already too far gone. Footsteps sounded behind her as Inspector Crail entered the room, face tight with suspicion. So, he said, we have another Keen. Miss Marple turned to him. Yes, and a complication. Crail eyed the stranger coldly. This still doesn't explain how the widow died. It explains a motive, Miss Marple replied, but not the method. For that, we must look more closely at the precise moment of the song, and who stood farthest from the fate when it ended. She turned toward the fire, watching its flicker cast shadows against the wall. There's one person, she murmured, who has said almost nothing since the fate, who has kept entirely to themselves. And yet, they were the first to arrive when Lottie screamed. Too quickly. Crail's eyes narrowed. Who? Miss Marple gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. That, Inspector, is what we must find out. But I believe we already know, we simply haven't listened closely enough. She reached into her handbag and pulled out the note, the dog tag, and a single black glove, retrieved from Briar Cottage the morning after the murder, from beneath the piano bench. The left glove. The right had never been found, until now. It lay just inside the parlour door, half hidden beneath the curtain hem, and Miss Marple, with the care of a botanist unearthing a rare specimen, reached down and picked it up. The right glove, a matched pair, one worn by the widow, and the other by the killer who had worn it to silence her song. Morning returned to Netherdean with the deceptive gentleness of any other day. Birds sang without pause, dew shimmered across hedgerows, and from the bakery came the familiar clatter of trays and tins. Yet beneath the routine something had shifted. The villagers felt it even if they couldn't name it. Conversations were softer, pauses longer. Rosalind Keen's death no longer felt like the intrusion of some distant tragedy. It had become intimate, rooted. Someone among them had sung her final note. Miss Marple stood in the parlour of the inn, the gloves, now properly paired, resting on the lace-trimmed windowsill. She had taken care not to disturb the right glove too much when retrieving it. The curtain hem had shielded it just enough, as though the killer, in the moments after the crime, had acted in haste. A right-handed person, she thought, and careful but not careful enough. The left glove had been found inside Briar Cottage, beneath the piano bench. The right, here, miles away. A strange separation, unless the killer had used Rosalind's. Gloves to mask their own prints. Worn one glove during the act, and unknowingly discarded the second amid their exit. Outside, the square grew busy with the whispering of errands and the ever-multiplying versions of events. Inspector Crail had taken Mr. Charles Keen into custody, not as a suspect, not yet, but for questioning. It was not enough to know that he had vanished and returned. It was who had noticed and who had used his reappearance as cover that mattered now. Miss Marple's next call was not to the police station, but to the home of Miss Cramley, the postmistress and unofficial village archivist. Her knowledge of correspondences and village gossip spanned back decades, and more importantly, she remembered details others dismissed as trivial. Miss Cramley answered the door, wrapped in a tartan shawl, with her usual expression of mild suspicion. "Oh, Miss Marple, you're out early." "Good morning, Miss Cramley. I hope I'm not intruding." "Not if you've brought something worth hearing," she said, standing aside. They sat in the cluttered sitting room where stacks of yellowing village newsletters stood like miniature towers, and a collection of owl figurines lined the mantel. Miss Marple waited until the tea was poured before speaking. "I wonder," she said, "do you recall who handled Rosalind Keen's forwarding mail when she first arrived in Netherdean?" "Oh, that's easy," Miss Cramley replied with a sniff. All newcomers must register. She had 2 parcels, both redirected from London. Handwritten labels. One came from a solicitor, Thomas Reeve and Harbury, Gray's Inn Road. The other, from a place in Surrey. She was very particular about collecting them herself. And did she ever send anything? Miss Cramley narrowed her eyes. A single letter, about 3 weeks ago. Special delivery, red wax seal, no return address. To where? Ah, Miss Cramley said, drawing it out. That's the interesting bit. The envelope was addressed to a Major F. Rowntree, care of the Ainsworth Residential House, St. Albans. Miss Marple set down her cup. Rowntree? Yes, odd name that. Doesn't quite match our local set, but it matched something else. Later. That day Miss Marple returned to Briar Cottage, now sealed under Crail's orders, but still accessible to her, owing to an understanding too old for paperwork. She walked through the rooms slowly, noting the careful arrangement of things. Rosalind's taste was refined, restrained. On a side table lay a folded newspaper, the Daily Sketch, dated one day before the fete. The bottom margin of the front page bore a handwritten annotation in faded blue ink. Not safe now. Decide before it's too late. The handwriting was distinctive. Miss Marple compared it quietly to the note found in the inn. It was different, more assertive, less elegant. Downstairs in the sitting room, she sat in Rosalind's chair, gazing. At the piano. It stood silent, lid closed. The last note of that fateful song long faded. She imagined Rosalind sitting here, hands trembling on the keys, knowing someone was listening, someone who had come back, or had never left. Her thoughts were interrupted by a quiet knock. It was Reverend Barker, hat in hand, face drawn with concern. "Forgive me, Miss Marple, may I come in?" "Of course," she said, rising. "I wanted to speak to you before Inspector Crail does," he said after sitting. "It's about the glove." "Yes?" "I saw it. The right glove." "The morning?" "After the fete, before the constables arrived, I came to the cottage and to say a prayer. I noticed it on the floor by the piano. I thought nothing of it at the time. Just assumed she'd dropped it. But later I realized it wasn't there when the inspector returned." "You believe someone took it?" "I do. Someone returned here. Quietly. And collected it." Miss Marple gave a slow nod. "I found it again. Not here, but at the inn." He stared at her. "Then whoever took it followed her there, or was already there," she murmured. "Waiting." Reverend Barker hesitated, then leaned forward. "There's something else. Last winter, before she sang at all, Mrs. Keene came to me in tears. She asked if I believed in second lives. I thought she meant the spiritual kind, but now I think she was talking about Charles." "Did she tell you about Cairo?" "Not directly, but she said her husband wasn't the man he once was. That she feared someone else had taken his place." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly. "How strange," she said, "that she spoke as if Charles were both present and absent." "She also mentioned a name," the vicar said. "Very quietly. She said Fletcher always knew." "I didn't understand it." "Fletcher Rowntree," Miss Marple said softly. "Major Rowntree, now retired, and still alive." Reverend Barker looked bewildered. "Then who was impersonated?" Miss Marple finished. "Quite possibly more than once. By the time she returned home, dusk had begun to gather. Her steps were deliberate now. The web of the thing was drawing close. Back in her drawing room, she retrieved her notebook. On the first page, she had written a list of names, crossed some out, circled others. Her pen hovered now over one. Mrs. Vincey. First to mention the voice, first to place the time, first to point. The finger at Raymond Edis, and first to reach the scene. Too quickly, she had said. Miss Marple remembered how Lottie had screamed, and almost immediately Mrs. Vincey had appeared at her side. The child had run no more than 20 yards, but the baker's wife had emerged from the far side of the fete, dress unrumpled, breathing steady. As if she'd been waiting. No flour on her hands, no apron. Miss Marple closed the notebook. Not everyone. Kills out of hatred. Some kill out of fear. Some kill because a story threatens to unravel, a story they themselves had sewn together long ago when a different name could still protect them. Mrs. Vincy had once lived in Egypt. That much was known. Her late husband had served there during the war, a quiet man barely spoken of now. But who had been his commanding officer, Major Rowntree? She had been there, had known the brothers Keane, and had chosen to become someone else when the war ended. Miss Marple stood and reached for her coat. It was time to speak plainly, and she would begin with the woman who had told the village what they heard, before they'd even had time to listen for themselves. Miss Marple arrived at the modest home of Mrs. Vincy in the fading light of late afternoon, the sky behind her painted in the soft purples and golds of early evening. The house stood quietly on the village lane, a neat brick cottage with climbing roses that had long since lost their bloom. The air was thick with the faint scent of baking bread, and somewhere inside, the ticking of a grandfather clock echoed through the rooms. She knocked gently, and the door opened almost immediately. Mrs. Vincy stood framed in the doorway, her posture upright, face carefully composed, but her eyes flickering with a hint of something unreadable, nervousness perhaps, or anticipation. "Miss Marple," she said in a voice as warm as fresh loaf, yet carrying an edge of steel, "do come in." Inside, the kitchen was tidy, spotless even. The worn wooden table bore a single teapot, a sugar bowl and 2 delicate cups. Mrs. Vincy gestured to a chair and began to pour tea with practiced precision. "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple began, settling herself with calm. "Nonsense. You are always welcome," Mrs. Vincy replied smoothly. "Though I suspect this visit has nothing to do with my baking skills." Miss Marple smiled softly. "You're quite right. I wanted to talk about the day of the fete." Mrs. Vincy's expression remained neutral, but there was a slight tightening around her mouth. "A sad day," she said. "Shocking for all of us." "Yes, and yet you were the first on the scene when the scream rang out." "That was pure chance," Mrs. Vincy answered quickly. "I was just coming out of the baker's with a fresh batch of rolls and heard the cry." "Quite," Miss Marple murmured. "Though some of the children say you came from the other side of the green where the kitchen garden lies. That would be a considerable distance to cover so swiftly." Mrs. Vincy's fingers gripped the handle of her teacup tightly. "I'm well acquainted with the village paths, Miss Marple, and I had no intention of being late to the fete." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed. You also mentioned the singing, the voice that floated from Briar Cottage. Did it seem normal to you that afternoon?" Mrs. Vincy's eyes flickered once more. "It was different," she admitted. "Too clear, too sudden. I thought the widow was ill." "Did you hear her speak with anyone that day? Anyone who might have been visiting or lurking nearby?" Mrs. Vincy shook her head. "No visitors that I saw, but I did notice a stranger lurking near the churchyard earlier that morning." "Stranger?" Miss Marple prompted. "A man," Mrs. Vincy said, lowering her voice. "Tall with a military bearing, not from around here, I'm sure." Miss Marple's thoughts raced. The mystery deepened. Someone watching, someone waiting, someone ready to silence the widow's song. "Mrs. Vincy," she said gently, "I must ask, did you ever know the Keane family well? Perhaps during the war?" There was a long pause. Mrs. Vincy's lips pressed together, as if deciding how much to reveal. "My husband served under Major Rowntree in Egypt," she confessed. "I knew the Keanes by association." Miss Marple leaned in. "And did you ever speak with Rosalind Keane herself? Perhaps about her past or the reasons she came here?" "Only rarely," Mrs. Vincy answered. "But she was haunted, that much was clear. She once confided that she feared old ghosts, men who had worn her husband's face and taken his place." The room seemed to grow colder. Miss Marple's fingers instinctively reached for the black gloves resting on her lap, a silent reminder of the vanished widow. "Mrs. Vincy," she said softly, "is there anything else you've been keeping from me? Any fear or resentment?" Mrs. Vincy's gaze faltered briefly, then met Miss Marple's with steely resolve. "I did what I thought was necessary to protect the village, and myself." Before Miss Marple could respond, the doorbell rang sharply. Mrs. Vincy rose, composed herself, and opened the door to reveal Inspector Crail, face set in grim determination. "Mrs. Vincy," he began without preamble, I must ask you to accompany me to the station for further questioning." The room seemed to hold its breath. Mrs. Vincey nodded slowly. "Very well." As they left, Miss Marple sat back, knitting needles, poised but still. The threads of deception were pulling tighter now. She knew the truth was near. Buried beneath, layers of loyalty, fear and betrayal. And in the shadows outside Briar Cottage, unseen eyes watched her retreating figure, calculating their next move. The village of Netherdean was settling into an uneasy calm when Miss Marple received word that Mrs. Vincey had been taken to the police station for further questioning. The news stirred a quiet but persistent ripple of gossip, whispered cautiously behind lace curtains and under the faint glow of street lamps. Yet Miss Marple herself remained composed, her mind weaving through the labyrinth of clues and half-truths with the patience of a spider spinning its web. Determined to draw out the final thread, she invited Raymond Eddis to the vicarage for tea. The invitation was framed as a casual gesture, a kindness toward a troubled young man, but beneath it lay a deliberate plan. She knew that subtle psychological pressure, an art as delicate as any theatrical performance, could reveal the hidden cracks in even the most carefully constructed facades. Raymond arrived shortly before 4 o'clock, his appearance worn but his eyes sharp with cautious curiosity. Miss Marple welcomed him with gentle warmth and seated him beside the window, where the light fell softly across the lace curtains and the garden beyond. "Mr. Eddis," she began, "I wonder if you might indulge an old lady's curiosity. It concerns the song your friend Mrs. Keene sang so faithfully every afternoon." He shifted slightly. "I suppose I must. It's hard to think about her without feeling that weight." "Indeed. You mentioned once that she trusted you to mimic her voice, that you read letters aloud for her amusement." He nodded. "She wanted to hear herself through someone else's words, said it made the past feel less sharp." Miss Marple's fingers twined in her lap. "And yet on the day of the fete the song ended abruptly, too abruptly to be natural. You have a keen ear, Mr. Eddis. Would you say the voice that day was hers?" Raymond's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "No, it wasn't. I heard a hesitation, a stiffness. The singer was unpracticed in her pain." "Interesting," said Miss Marple. "And you heard a man's voice that evening, the night before she died, speaking with her?" "Yes. Deep, military, firm, but not unkind." "Did Mrs. Keene say his name?" "No," he replied. "But I thought it might be Charles Keene or someone pretending to be him." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him a moment before she spoke again. "Tell me, Mr. Eddis, did you ever feel afraid in Rosalind's company?" He looked surprised. "Afraid? No, not of her." "Of others," she said quietly. "Those who might come for her." He swallowed. "Yes, there was a man, a shadow. I saw him once, watching from the garden's edge. I don't know who he was, but he had eyes that didn't blink." Miss Marple smiled gently. "We all carry shadows. Some cast longer than others." The conversation turned then to more mundane matters, the state of the village, the weather, a shared love of Wilde's poetry. Yet beneath the surface, the subtle currents of tension began to stir. Miss Marple noted the way Raymond's hands trembled slightly when the topic returned to the widow, the slight hesitation before his answers, the flicker of memory in his eyes. After tea she excused herself briefly, returning with a small box, a music box intricately carved and old. She wound it slowly, allowing the delicate notes to fill the room. "Do you recognize this tune?" she asked. Raymond's breath caught. "It's the song she sang," he whispered. Miss Marple smiled. "Yes, but listen carefully." As the music played, she observed Raymond closely. His hands clenched, his eyes darted toward the door, as if expecting someone to appear. "And now," she said softly, "imagine hearing this from the window of Briar Cottage every afternoon, a signal meant for someone who may no longer be listening." He swallowed hard. I don't understand." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "But you do. You know the meaning beneath the melody, the desperation, the warning." Suddenly, the front door opened, and Inspector Crail entered, his expression unreadable. "Ah, Raymond," he said, We were just about to look for you." Raymond paled but maintained his composure. Miss Marple watched, her mind racing. As the inspector spoke in low tones with Raymond, Miss Marple caught sight of a figure watching from the window across the street, a woman veiled in shadow. Later, when Raymond had left under gentle escort, Miss Marple approached the window. "The watcher," she murmured, "the woman who sings in the dark." Her gaze fell on the glove still lying on the windowsill, the silent testament of a secret too long concealed. Miss Marple understood now. To catch the killer, she must provoke the very person who thought themselves invisible. The final test would require patience, subtlety, and a knowing smile. The past was not yet done speaking. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting delicate patterns on the floor. The village of Netherdean, though outwardly serene, was simmering with unease, an unspoken tension that threaded its way through every conversation, every glance. Yet Miss Marple sat composed, hands folded over her knitting, eyes sharp and contemplative. The pieces of the puzzle lay before her like scattered petals: the twin gloves, the note bearing the initials ACK, the mysterious visitor claiming to be Charles Keene, the mimic with his haunted memories, and Mrs. Vincey's sudden arrest. But none of it, she felt, told the full story. Not yet. She began by assembling the known facts, not just the physical evidence, but the intricate human threads, the grudges, the fears, the whispers of old wounds. Rosalind Keene, widow of a man, officially declared dead, lived cloaked in shadow, singing a song that was part warning, part mourning. Her husband's brother, Charles, thought lost to fire and war, had returned, not openly but as a ghost in the village's collective memory. A man once displaced, now perhaps displaced again. Mrs. Vincey, with her wartime connections and swift movements, had been the first at the scene. Her husband's ties to Major Rowntree connected her to the military circle shadowing the Keenes' history. Raymond Edis, the mimic, a man caught between roles, had witnessed more than he admitted and carried a fear not entirely his own. And then there was the mysterious figure Miss Marple had glimpsed watching from the window, a woman whose identity remained a secret, but whose presence was undeniable. She summoned Inspector Crail to her house, a quiet invitation rather than a command. "When you last spoke with Mrs. Vincey," she began, pouring 2 cups of tea, "did you notice anything that seemed out of place?" Crail frowned. Her composure was striking, too composed, some might say. "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly. "People who commit a crime often do so with a practiced mask." Crail nodded slowly. She admitted to having secrets connected to the Keene family, but no direct motive. Miss Marple leaned forward, voice gentle but firm. "Secrets are a burden, Inspector. They can breed resentment or fear. In this case, perhaps both." The inspector sighed. "You always make this look so easy," she smiled. "It's a matter of listening to what people don't say, rather than what they do." That afternoon they gathered the suspects at the vicarage, the very heart of the village where propriety was expected, but rarely maintained under pressure. Mrs. Vincey arrived in a sober black dress, face pale but unwavering. Raymond Edis appeared nervously, adjusting his jacket as if bracing for a storm. Charles Keene, the returned brother, stood silent in the corner, his eyes flickering between them all. Miss Marple began with quiet questions, weaving her words carefully. "To begin, Mrs. Vincey, you were quick to the scene. Tell us why." I was concerned." "Mrs." Vincey replied, voice steady. "Rosalind was a troubled soul. I feared something might happen." "And did you see anyone else near Briar Cottage that day?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Vincey hesitated, then admitted, "Yes, a man. Major Rowntree." Gasps rippled through the room. Rowntree, a dignified older gentleman with a keen gaze, stepped forward. "I have nothing to hide," Miss Marple nodded. "Yet, Major, you have long-standing connections to the Keenes. Care to explain your visit?" Rowntree's jaw tightened. "I came to discuss a matter of family honor. The truth of Charles Keene's fate. And the letter from Rosalind to you," Miss Marple asked, holding up a copy. He sighed. She was desperate. She feared the past catching up. I promised to help her keep it hidden." "Did that promise include silence over your own actions?" Miss Marple pressed. Rowntree's face darkened. "I did what was necessary." The room held its breath. Miss Marple turned then to Charles Keene. "You returned to Netherdean under an assumed shadow. Why?" "To protect what remains," he said quietly. "My brother's death was a secret, but so was mine. And you, Mr. Edis," she continued, "were you aware of this secret before your arrival?" "I suspected," Raymond admitted, "but I never imagined the depths." Finally, Miss Marple's gaze settled on Mrs. Vincy. "You feared the consequences of these secrets unraveling. Did that fear lead to desperation?" Mrs. Vincy's eyes glistened. "I loved this village. I loved the peace. I would have done anything to protect it. And you did," Miss Marple said gently. "But in doing so, you silenced Rosalind." A heavy silence followed. "It was you who sang," Mrs. Vincy confessed, voice trembling. "I heard her song, learned its timing. I thought if I could imitate it, I might keep the truth buried longer. But I was wrong." "Why kill her?" Crail asked. "She threatened to expose us all," Mrs. Vincy said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I couldn't let her ruin everything." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "Secrets are powerful, Mrs. Vincy, but truth has a way of rising. As the police took Mrs. Vincy away, the village seemed to exhale, the weight of silence lifting. Later, alone in her sitting room, Miss Marple reflected on the nature of human frailty, the lengths to which people would go to protect themselves and their loved ones. She carefully folded the matched gloves, the letter, and the dog tag into a small box. The widow's song was finally still, but the echoes lingered in the hedgerows of Netherdean, a reminder that even in the quietest villages, the darkest secrets wait patiently to be uncovered. The village of Netherdean slowly began to reclaim its peaceful rhythms, though a subtle unease lingered beneath the surface, as if the very air had been altered by the revelation of buried truths. The autumn leaves rustled differently, and the once familiar faces wore traces of sorrow or guarded reflection. Yet the market days returned, the post office buzzed softly, and the church bells rang with undiminished clarity. Miss Marple sat by her window in the soft light of a late afternoon, the gentle ticking of her grandmother's clock marking the passage of time. In her lap rested the small box containing the matched gloves, the faded letter, and the dog tag, a silent testament to the complexities of human nature and the fragile web of secrets spun within the village. The arrest of Mrs. Vincy had brought relief to many, but Miss Marple knew better than to assume the story was truly over. She thought of Rosalind Keene, the widow who had sung in the dark, not merely a victim of a crime, but of the shadows cast by fear, loyalty, and long-forgotten wars. Her voice, once a haunting melody drifting through the hedgerows, had been silenced, yet its echo remained. A soft knock interrupted Miss Marple's reverie. It was Reverend Barker, carrying a parcel of fresh-baked scones wrapped in a tea towel. "I thought you might like some company," he said gently. She smiled, gesturing to the chair beside her. "You are always welcome, Reverend." They settled by the fire, the quiet companionship a balm against the weight of recent events. "I spoke with some of the villagers today," the vicar began. "There is talk, more than usual, about the burdens we carry and the facades we maintain. Rosalind's story has made them think." Miss Marple nodded. "It is often easier to look away than to confront the truths beneath the surface," he sighed. "Yet you saw what others missed. You understood the song, the gloves, the hidden messages." She smiled softly. "Years of listening have taught me that people speak in many ways, not always with words. Sometimes a gesture, a silence, or even a song can tell the whole story." The room grew quiet, the firelight flickering over the worn pages of Miss Marple's knitting pattern. "Do you think the village will ever be the same?" the vicar asked. "Perhaps not," she replied. "But then change is the only certainty in life. The important thing is that we carry forward with kindness and understanding." As dusk settled, Miss Marple rose to close the curtains, pausing for a moment to glance toward Briar Cottage, now shuttered and silent. The garden lay undisturbed, a small sanctuary reclaimed by nature. Her thoughts drifted to the widow's final song, a melody of sorrow and hope intertwined. In the days that followed, Life in Netherdean resumed its gentle course, the wounds beginning to heal. Mrs. Vincey faced the consequences of her actions, the village rallying quietly around the families touched by tragedy. Charles Keene chose to leave, seeking a fresh start far from the shadows of his past. Raymond Edis found solace in his art, his voice no longer burdened by ghosts. Miss Marple continued her walks through the village lanes, greeting neighbours, with the warmth of one who understands both the darkness and the light in human hearts. And in the stillness of her sitting room, she often reflected on the truth that lies beneath the surface, the delicate threads of trust and betrayal that bind us all. The widow who sang in the dark had finally found her peace, and with it, the village of Netherdean had reclaimed its own. The end.